Pine Hollow sat nestled in the Colorado Rockies at an elevation of 8,200 feet, a town that barely qualified as a dot on most maps. In the early 1970s, it was home to roughly 380 people, most of whom had lived there for generations. The town consisted of a main street lined with wooden storefronts that had weathered a century of mountain winters, a single gas station, a general store, a diner called Maggie's that served as the unofficial town hall, and a small medical clinic run by Dr. Raymond Walsh, who had moved there in 1968 after retiring from a hospital in Denver. The surrounding mountains were dense with ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, and in winter, the snowfall could isolate the town for days at a time. Most residents made their living from logging, hunting, or catering to the handful of tourists who ventured up the winding mountain roads during summer months. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where doors were left unlocked, and where the biggest excitement of the week was the Friday night high school basketball game. But in October 1972, something changed in Pine Hollow. Something that would transform the quiet mountain community into a place of whispers and fear. The first sign that something was wrong came on October 14, 1972, when Robert Mendoza failed to show up for his shift at the lumber mill. Robert, a 53-year-old foreman who had worked at the mill for 30 years, was known for his punctuality. He arrived at 6 in the morning without fail, 5 days a week, and had never missed a day of work in over a decade. When he didn't appear that Saturday morning, his supervisor, Frank Garrison, thought perhaps Robert had taken ill. Frank tried calling Robert's house, but there was no answer. By noon, Frank drove out to Robert's cabin, which sat 3 miles outside town on a dirt road that wound through thick forest. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life. The cabin's front door was wide open, swinging slightly in the cold October wind. Inside, the furniture was overturned, dishes were shattered on the kitchen floor, and there were signs of a violent struggle. But there was no blood, no body, nothing to indicate what had happened to Robert Mendoza. The only thing Frank noticed, and what made his skin crawl, was a single detail that seemed impossibly out of place. On the kitchen table, arranged in a perfect circle, were 7 owl feathers, each one pristine and white, standing upright as if they had been carefully positioned. Sheriff Tom Bradshaw arrived at the scene within an hour of Frank's panic phone call. Tom had been sheriff of Cascade County for 15 years and had dealt with his share of missing persons cases, usually hikers who wandered off trails or teenagers who ran away to Denver. But this felt different. The meticulous arrangement of the feathers, the violence evident in the overturned furniture, and the complete absence of Robert Mendoza created an unsettling picture that Tom couldn't quite piece together. He called in a search party, and by late afternoon, 20 volunteers were combing the woods around Robert's property, calling his name, looking for any trace of where he might have gone. They searched until darkness made it impossible to continue, finding nothing but elk tracks and the normal debris of the forest floor. The next morning, they resumed the search, expanding their radius to cover 5 square miles of mountainous terrain. It was on that second day, just after noon, when a young volunteer named Chris Patterson made a discovery that would mark the true beginning of Pine Hollow's nightmare. Deep in the forest, nearly 2 miles from Robert's cabin, Chris found a piece of torn fabric caught on a low branch. The fabric was from a flannel shirt, the same red and black pattern that several witnesses confirmed Robert had been wearing the last time he was seen in town. But what made Chris call out for the sheriff wasn't the fabric itself. It was what lay 30 feet beyond it, in a small clearing surrounded by ancient pines. There, in the center of the clearing, was Robert Mendoza's body, or what remained of it. The scene was something that would require explanations from medical examiners, state police investigators, and eventually specialists brought in from Denver and even as far as Washington. Robert Mendoza was lying face up, his arms spread wide, his legs straight. His flannel shirt had been torn open, the buttons scattered in the dirt around him. But the most horrifying detail, the one that made even seasoned search and rescue volunteers turn away and vomit into the bushes, was the condition of his chest. It had been opened, not with the crude tearing of an animal attack, but with what appeared to be precise, almost surgical cuts. And inside that cavity, where his heart should have been, there was nothing but an empty space, the surrounding tissue cleanly removed. Dr. Walsh arrived at the scene within an hour, his medical bag clutched tightly in his weathered hands. He knelt beside the body, his face growing paler with each passing second as he examined the wound. When Sheriff Bradshaw asked him what could have done this, Dr. Walsh looked up with eyes that held more confusion than certainty. He said it looked like a surgical extraction, performed with remarkable precision, but done in the middle of a forest, miles from any medical facility, with no explanation for how or why. The sheriff immediately called the state police, and by evening, investigators had cordoned off the area, marking it as a crime scene. But even as they collected evidence, took photographs, and bagged samples of soil and tissue, no one could provide an answer that made sense. The autopsy, conducted 2 days later in Denver, would only deepen the mystery, confirming that Robert Mendoza's heart had been removed with extraordinary skill and that he had been alive when the procedure began. The news of Robert Mendoza's death spread through Pine Hollow like wildfire through dry timber. By the evening of October 16th, when his body was finally transported to Denver for autopsy, every resident of the town had heard some version of the story. The details varied depending on who was telling it, but certain elements remained consistent. Robert had been found in the woods. His chest had been opened. His heart was missing. In Maggie's Diner, where the coffee was always hot and the gossip always hotter, people gathered in clusters, their voices low and urgent. Some blamed a mountain lion, despite Dr. Walsh's insistence that no animal could make such precise cuts. Others whispered about a deranged killer loose in the mountains, perhaps someone who had escaped from a prison or mental institution. A few of the older residents, particularly those with roots in the area going back before Colorado was even a state, spoke in hushed tones about old stories, legends that their grandparents had told them, tales that most people had dismissed as superstition. But in the wake of Robert Mendoza's death, those old stories didn't seem quite so impossible anymore. Sheriff Bradshaw held a town meeting on October 18th at the community center, a drafty building that also served as the town's polling place and venue for wedding receptions. Nearly 300 people showed up, filling every seat and lining the walls. Tom stood at the front of the room, his uniform pressed, his expression serious but calm. He explained what they knew, which wasn't much, and what they were doing about it, which was everything possible. State police were investigating, he said. They had brought in tracking dogs, forensic specialists, and investigators with decades of experience. They would find whoever did this, he promised, and they would bring them to justice. But promises couldn't erase fear, and fear had taken root in Pine Hollow like a weed in a garden. Parents who had always let their children roam freely through the woods now kept them close to home. The logging crews, which normally worked from dawn until dusk, began finishing their shifts earlier. Nobody wanted to be in the forest when darkness fell. The gas station owner, Harold Chun, started closing at 5 o'clock instead of 8, and the handful of businesses along Main Street followed suit. By early November, Pine Hollow had transformed from a sleepy mountain town into a place where people locked their doors, checked their windows, and slept with rifles within arm's reach. And then, on November 3, 1972, it happened again. This time, the victim was a woman named Janet Reeves, a 38-year-old schoolteacher who lived alone in a small house on the eastern edge of town. Janet had taught third grade at Pine Hollow Elementary for 12 years and was beloved by her students and their parents alike. She was known for her kindness, her patience, and her habit of taking long walks through the forest every evening after school, a routine she had maintained for years. On November 3rd, she left her house at her usual time, around 4:30 in the afternoon, wearing her hiking boots and her favorite blue jacket. Several people saw her walking toward the trailhead that led up to Eagle Ridge, a popular hiking spot that offered spectacular views of the valley below. She waved to neighbors, stopped to pet a dog that belonged to the Williamson family, and seemed in good spirits. That was the last time anyone saw Janet Reeves alive. When Janet didn't show up for school the next morning, the principal, Margaret Foster, called her house repeatedly, getting no answer. By mid-morning, Margaret drove to Janet's home and found it empty, the door unlocked, Janet's car parked in the driveway. Inside, everything was neat and orderly, exactly as Janet always kept it. There were no signs of struggle, no indication that anything was wrong, except for one small detail that Margaret noticed on the kitchen counter. There, arranged in a perfect circle, were 7 white owl feathers, standing upright, identical to the ones found in Robert Mendoza's cabin 3 weeks earlier. Margaret felt her stomach drop. She immediately called Sheriff Bradshaw, and within minutes he was at the house, staring at those feathers with a growing sense of dread. He organized another search party, this one even larger than the first, with over 40 volunteers and a team of state police officers with tracking dogs. They started at the trailhead where Janet had last been seen and worked their way up the mountain, calling her name, searching every ravine and thicket. The search continued through the afternoon and into the evening, but as darkness fell and temperatures dropped below freezing, Tom had no choice but to call it off until morning. That night, hardly anyone in Pine Hollow slept. The fear that had been simmering since Robert's death now boiled over into outright terror. Parents kept their children home from school the next day. The grocery store, normally busy on Friday mornings, stood nearly empty. And in living rooms throughout the town, people gathered around their television sets, watching the news reports that were now covering Pine Hollow's tragedies, turning their quiet community into a spectacle for the outside world. The search resumed at dawn on November 5th, with volunteers arriving from neighboring towns, some driving over an hour through mountain passes to help look for Janet Reeves. It was a rancher named Bill Thompson, who lived 15 miles south of Pine Hollow, who found her body just after 10 o'clock in the morning. She was lying in a clearing similar to the one where Robert Mendoza had been found, her body positioned in the same way, arms spread, legs straight. Her blue jacket had been torn open, and her chest cavity had been opened with the same surgical precision that had been used on Robert. And just like Robert, her heart was gone, removed with a skill that suggested medical training or something far worse. Dr. Walsh examined the body at the scene, his hands trembling as he made his preliminary assessment. The method was identical, he told Sheriff Bradshaw. Whoever or whatever was doing this had done it the same way twice, which meant they were dealing with either a serial killer with surgical expertise or something that defied rational explanation. The state police immediately escalated the investigation, bringing in FBI agents from the Denver field office and forensic pathologists from the University of Colorado. They interviewed every resident of Pine Hollow, took statements from anyone who had seen Janet on the day she disappeared, and analyzed every piece of physical evidence they could find. But despite all their resources, all their expertise, and all their technology, they found nothing that brought them closer to understanding who or what was responsible. The only clue, if it could be called that, was the owl feathers. 7 white owl feathers, arranged in a perfect circle, found at both crime scenes. And for those who remember the old stories, those feathers carried a meaning that modern investigators refused to consider. By mid-November 1972, Pine Hollow had become a town under siege, not from an army or a natural disaster, but from an invisible terror that struck without warning and left no trace except for the bodies it created. The FBI set up a temporary command center in the community center, filling the space with filing cabinets, computers, and maps covered with pins marking relevant locations. Special Agent Catherine Morrison, a veteran investigator with 15 years of experience hunting serial killers, led the federal team. She was methodical, thorough, and deeply skeptical of anything that couldn't be explained by evidence and logic. She interviewed dozens of residents, reviewed autopsy reports, and studied crime scene photographs until she could see them in her sleep. But despite all her efforts, the investigation stalled. There were no fingerprints, no DNA evidence that could be analyzed with the limited technology of the early 1970s, and no witnesses who had seen anything suspicious. The only consistent elements were the surgical precision of the heart removal and those mysterious owl feathers, which laboratory analysis confirmed came from a great horned owl, a species common throughout Colorado. Agent Morrison theorized they were dealing with someone with medical training, possibly a surgeon who had suffered some kind of mental breakdown. She ordered background checks on every doctor, nurse, and medical student within a 100-mile radius, looking for anyone with a history of violence or psychological instability. But that investigation, too, led nowhere. Every medical professional in the area had solid alibis and no connection to either victim. Meanwhile, life in Pine Hollow had ground nearly to a halt. The elementary school remained closed, deemed too risky by the school board until the killer was caught. The logging operations, which employed nearly a quarter of a town's workforce, had suspended all activities, leaving families without income and unsure when they would be able to return to work. Many residents, particularly those with young children, began making plans to leave town entirely, moving to Denver or Colorado Springs or anywhere that felt safer than the shadow of the Rockies. Those who stayed did so either because they had nowhere else to go or because they refused to be driven from their homes by fear. Among those who stayed was Daniel Crowfoot, a 42-year-old mechanic who ran the only auto repair shop in Pine Hollow. Daniel was half Seminole, his mother having moved to Colorado from Oklahoma in the 1940s. He had grown up hearing his mother's stories about the old ways, the spirits and creatures that existed in the world alongside humans, invisible to most, but very real to those who knew how to see them. When Daniel heard about the owl feathers found at both crime scenes, something clicked in his memory. He remembered a story his mother had told him when he was a child, a story about the Stikini shape-shifting witches from Seminole legend who could transform into owls and prey upon the living, stealing their hearts to extend their own unnatural lives. At the time, he had dismissed it as folklore, the kind of tale meant to scare children into behaving. But now, faced with two inexplicable deaths and those owl feathers, Daniel wondered if perhaps the old stories held more truth than he had ever imagined. On November 18th, Daniel went to see Sheriff Bradshaw at the temporary office Tom had set up in the back room of the general store. Tom was exhausted, his face lined with stress, his eyes red from lack of sleep. He had been working 18-hour days since Robert Mendoza's body was found, coordinating with state and federal investigators, managing search parties, and trying to keep the town from descending into complete chaos. When Daniel walked in and said he wanted to talk about the possibility that they were dealing with something supernatural, Tom's first instinct was to dismiss him entirely. But Daniel was persistent, and Tom, desperate for any lead no matter how unlikely, agreed to listen. Daniel explained the legend of the Stikini as his mother had told it to him. According to Seminole tradition, a Stikini was a person, usually someone who had delved into dark magic and forbidden practices, who could remove their own organs, hide them, and transform into a great owl. In owl form, they would hunt for victims, killing them and consuming their hearts to gain vitality and extend their lives. The Stikini could only be killed if someone found their hidden organs and destroyed them while the creature was in owl form. If the organs were intact, the Stikini could regenerate and continue their predation indefinitely. Daniel acknowledged it sounded insane, but he pointed out that nothing else explained the surgical precision, the missing hearts, or the owl feathers. Tom listened, his expression unreadable, and when Daniel finished, there was a long silence. Finally, Tom said he would keep an open mind, which was the most Daniel could hope for. But privately, Tom couldn't bring himself to believe in shape-shifting witches and supernatural creatures. He was a man of evidence and procedure, and despite the strangeness of the case, he believed there had to be a rational explanation. Agent Morrison was even less receptive when Tom mentioned Daniel's theory during a briefing later that day. She looked at him as if he had suggested they consult a fortune teller or conduct a seance. The FBI, she reminded him curtly, dealt in facts, not folklore. They were looking for a human killer, someone with surgical skills and a deeply disturbed mind, not a mythical creature from Native American legend. Tom didn't argue, but he also didn't completely dismiss what Daniel had told him. Over the next week, he found himself thinking about it more than he wanted to admit, especially when the investigation continued to yield no results. And then, on November 27th, the day before Thanksgiving, the creature struck again. The victim this time was a 16-year-old boy named Marcus Lee, the younger brother of Harold Chun, who owned the gas station. Marcus was a junior at Pine Hollow High School, a quiet kid who loved reading and spent most of his free time at the small-town library. On the evening of November 27th, Marcus left the library around 6 o'clock, planning to walk the 3 blocks home. He never arrived. His family reported him missing within an hour, and Sheriff Bradshaw, now grimly familiar with the pattern, immediately organized a search party. They found Marcus's body the next morning, Thanksgiving Day, in the same kind of clearing where the others had been discovered, positioned identically, his chest opened, his heart gone. And there, on a flat rock near his body, were 7 white owl feathers arranged in a perfect circle. The town's fragile composure shattered completely. People packed their belongings and fled Pine Hollow in droves, loading cars and trucks with whatever they could carry. By the end of November, the population had dropped by nearly a third, and those who remained did so in a state of constant fear, jumping at shadows and sleeping with weapons close at hand. As December 1972 settled over Pine Hollow, bringing with it early snowfalls and temperatures that plunged below zero at night, the town had become a place that existed more in fear than in function. The Main Street businesses that hadn't closed entirely operated on reduced hours, their owners staying late into the evening only out of financial desperation rather than any sense of normalcy. The FBI presence had increased, with more agents arriving from Denver and even Washington, but their expanded resources had produced no breakthroughs. Agent Morrison held daily press conferences, assuring the public that they were pursuing multiple leads and that an arrest was imminent. But those who lived in Pine Hollow could see the frustration in her eyes, could hear the uncertainty beneath her carefully chosen words. The truth was that the investigation had stalled completely, mired in a case that defied every conventional approach to criminal profiling and forensic analysis. The autopsies on all 3 victims revealed identical methodology, surgical precision that suggested years of medical training. Yet no surgeon or doctor in the region matched the profile of a serial killer. The owl feathers, analyzed by wildlife experts from 3 different universities, were confirmed as coming from great horned owls, but beyond that basic identification, they offered no useful information. No fingerprints, no DNA, no fibers or trace evidence that could lead investigators to a suspect. It was as if the killer existed in a realm beyond forensic science, striking with impunity and vanishing without a trace. Daniel Crowfoot spent those December days researching everything he could find about the Stechini legend. He called his aunt in Oklahoma, who was more versed in Seminole traditions than his late mother had been, and she confirmed the details he remembered, adding information that made his blood run cold. According to her, a Stechini chose a territory and would hunt within it until they were destroyed or until they decided to move on. They were drawn to isolated communities, places where their activities might be attributed to animal attacks or human violence rather than supernatural predation. And most critically, she told him that a Stechini could only be stopped by finding their hidden organs, typically concealed in a secret location known only to the creature itself, and destroying them while the Stechini was in owl form. If someone managed to do this, the creature would die instantly, unable to return to human form. But finding those organs was nearly impossible, she said, because the Stechini chose hiding places that were remote, protected, and often warded with rituals that kept others away. Daniel asked her how someone would even begin to search for such a thing, and his aunt suggested looking for places that felt wrong, locations where the natural order seemed disturbed, where animals avoided, and where the air itself felt heavy with malevolence. Armed with this information, Daniel decided to conduct his own investigation, knowing that neither the sheriff nor the FBI would take his theories seriously without evidence. On December 10th, Daniel began hiking through the forest surrounding Pine Hollow, searching for anything that matched his aunt's description. He covered miles of mountainous terrain each day, moving through snow and bitter cold, looking for signs of the unnatural. For 3 days, he found nothing but wilderness, the normal rhythms of winter settling over the Rockies. But on the 4th day, December 14th, he discovered something that made him stop in his tracks. He had hiked nearly 6 miles from town, following a ridge that overlooked a narrow valley few people visited even in summer. As he descended into the valley, moving carefully through knee-deep snow, he noticed something odd. The birds, which should have been calling from the trees, were completely silent. No ravens, no jays, no chickadees. The silence was absolute, oppressive, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Daniel continued forward, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, but his determination overriding his fear. He reached the valley floor and saw, partially hidden by snow-covered brush, the entrance to a small cave. The opening was narrow, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through, and it exhaled cold air that carried with it a scent Daniel couldn't quite identify, something organic and rotten, like meat left too long in summer heat. He pulled a flashlight from his pack and shone it into the cave's mouth. The beam revealed a passage that extended back into darkness, the walls rough stone, the floor littered with bones. Daniel felt his heart hammering in his chest as he squeezed through the opening and entered the cave. The passage led him 30 feet into the mountain before opening into a small chamber, perhaps 15 feet across. The smell here was overpowering, and Daniel had to fight the urge to vomit. His flashlight beam swept across the chamber, revealing details that confirmed his worst suspicions. The walls were covered with crude drawings, symbols that looked ancient and malevolent, depicting owls with outstretched talons and figures with their chests torn open. On the floor of the chamber, arranged on a flat stone that served as a makeshift altar, were several objects that made Daniel's skin crawl. There were more owl feathers, dozens of them, arranged in patterns that suggested ritual significance. There were small bones, some human, some animal, cleaned and placed in specific arrangements. And, in the center of the altar, preserved in some way that Daniel didn't understand, were human organs. 3 hearts, to be specific, each one placed in a clay jar, the jars themselves inscribed with symbols similar to those on the cave walls. Daniel knew immediately what he had found. This was the Stakini's lair, the place where it hid the organs it removed from its own body before transforming, and where it kept the hearts of its victims, trophies of its hunts. His aunt had told him that destroying these organs while the creature was in owl form would kill it permanently. But first, he had to convince someone in authority that what he had found was real, and that the solution to Pine Hollow's nightmare lay not in conventional police work, but in accepting a truth that defied modern understanding. He carefully marked the location in his mind, memorizing landmarks and taking note of a route he had followed, then made his way back through the passage and out into the winter daylight. He needed to get Sheriff Bradshaw to listen to him, truly listen, and to bring him to this cave before the Stakini struck again. Because Daniel was certain, with every fiber of his being, that it would strike again, and soon. Daniel Crowfoot returned to town on the afternoon of December 14th, his mind racing with what he had discovered. He went straight to the sheriff's office, bursting through the door with an urgency that made Deputy Miller reach for his sidearm before recognizing who it was. Daniel demanded to see Sheriff Bradshaw immediately, and when Tom emerged from his back office, Daniel pulled him aside and explained everything he had found in the cave. He described the symbols on the walls, the altar with its jars containing human hearts, the overwhelming sense of malevolence that permeated the chamber. Tom listened, his expression shifting from skepticism to concern as Daniel spoke. When Daniel finished, Tom asked if he could show them the location, and Daniel agreed immediately. Within an hour, they had assembled a small team: Tom, Daniel, Agent Morrison, and 2 state police officers. They hiked out into the mountains, following Daniel's route, moving through the snow-covered forest as afternoon gave way to early evening. The temperature dropped steadily, and by the time they reached the valley, it was nearly 20 degrees below freezing. Daniel led them to the cave entrance, and one by one, they squeezed through the narrow opening and entered the passage beyond. The flashlights revealed everything Daniel had described. Agent Morrison, despite her skepticism about supernatural explanations, couldn't hide her shock at what she was seeing. The hearts in the jars were real, human tissue preserved through some method she couldn't immediately identify. The symbols on the walls were unlike anything in her experience, not matching any known gang markings or ritualistic patterns from previous cases. She ordered her team to photograph everything, to collect samples, to treat the cave as a crime scene. But even as they worked, Tom could see the uncertainty in her eyes. This didn't fit any profile she had encountered, didn't match any serial killer methodology in the FBI's extensive database. Daniel stood near the altar, staring at the jars, and quietly told Tom that they needed to destroy these organs, that doing so while the Stakini was in owl form would kill it permanently. Tom asked how they would know when the creature was transformed, and Daniel said the only way would be to wait, to watch, to be ready when it struck again. Agent Morrison overheard and immediately rejected the idea. They were dealing with evidence, she said, not supernatural artifacts. This would be analyzed properly, scientifically, and it would lead them to their killer. But as they prepared to leave the cave, something happened that would change everything. They heard it first, a sound that echoed through the valley from somewhere above, a screeching call that was unmistakably an owl, but carried with it something else, something that made the hair on the back of their necks stand up. The sound repeated, closer now, and then they saw it through the cave entrance, silhouetted against the darkening sky. An owl, massive beyond any normal size, its wingspan easily 6 feet across, circled above the valley. Its eyes, even from a distance, seemed to glow with an intelligence that was distinctly unnatural. Daniel whispered that it was here, that the Stakini had sensed their presence in its lair and had come to defend it. Agent Morrison, her hand on her service weapon, stepped toward the cave entrance, but Tom grabbed her arm. If Daniel was right, if this was truly what he claimed it was, then bullets wouldn't stop it. They needed to destroy the organs, now, while the creature was in owl form. Morrison hesitated, her training warring with the evidence of her own eyes, and in that moment of hesitation, the owl dove toward the cave entrance. The team scrambled backward as the creature came at them, its talons extended, its screeching filling the small chamber with a sound that was almost physically painful. One of the state police officers fired his weapon, the shot deafening in the confined space. The bullet struck the owl's wing, and for a moment it faltered, but then it recovered and came at them again. Daniel grabbed one of the jars from the altar and smashed it against the stone floor. The heart inside tumbled out, and Daniel stomped on it with his boot, crushing it completely. The owl in the cave entrance shrieked, a sound of pure agony, and one of its wings went limp. It was working. Tom grabbed another jar and smashed it, and Agent Morrison, finally understanding, grabbed the third. Together, they destroyed all 3 hearts, grinding them into the cave floor as the owl thrashed and screamed. And then, suddenly, it was over. The owl fell from where it had been hovering near the entrance, its body hitting the ground with a heavy thud. For a moment, it lay there, twitching, and then it began to change. The transformation was horrifying to witness. The owl's body convulsed, its feathers seeming to melt and absorb into the flesh beneath. The wings shortened and reshaped, becoming arms, the talons elongating into fingers. The beak receded, revealing a human face twisted in agony. Within minutes, what lay on the cave floor was no longer an owl, but a person, naked and dying. It was a woman, perhaps 60 years old. Her body emaciated and covered in scars that looked like they had been inflicted over decades. Her chest was open, revealing an empty cavity where her organs should have been, the same surgical precision they had seen on the victims' bodies. She looked up at them with eyes that held both fury and resignation, and she spoke in a voice that was barely a whisper. She said she had been hunting in these mountains for over a century, taking hearts to sustain her existence, hiding in plain sight among the communities that came and went. She had been many things, many people, always moving when suspicion grew too great, always finding new hunting grounds. Pine Hollow had been perfect, isolated and trusting, until Daniel had figured out what she was. She cursed them all, and then she died, her body collapsing in on itself as whatever dark magic had sustained her finally released its hold. The team stood in shocked silence, staring at a corpse that had moments ago been a massive owl. Agent Morrison was the first to speak, her voice shaking slightly. She said they needed to document everything, to get forensic teams up here, to figure out how to explain this in a way that wouldn't make them all sound insane. But Tom knew that some things couldn't be explained, not in ways that would satisfy official reports or court proceedings. They had killed something that shouldn't exist, something that had preyed on his town for months, and the truth of what had happened in this cave would likely never be fully acknowledged by the authorities. They carefully collected what evidence they could, photographing the body, the destroyed hearts, the symbols on the walls. Then they made their way back to Pine Hollow, arriving after midnight, exhausted and traumatized by what they had witnessed. Over the next several days, the official story took shape. Agent Morrison reported that they had found the killer's hideout, a mentally disturbed woman who had been living in the mountains and attacking residents of Pine Hollow. She had been killed while resisting arrest, and the case was closed. The truth about the transformation, about the supernatural nature of what they had encountered, was buried in classified reports that would never see public release. Pine Hollow slowly began to recover. Families who had fled started to return, reassured by the FBI's announcement that the killer was dead and the threat eliminated. The logging operations resumed, schools reopened, and life gradually returned to something resembling normalcy. But those who had been in the cave that day carried the memory of what they had seen, and it changed them in ways both subtle and profound. Daniel Crowfoot found himself regarded with a mixture of respect and unease by his neighbors, people who had heard rumors about his role in ending the nightmare. He continued to run his auto repair shop, but he also became a keeper of the old stories, someone people would quietly approach when strange things happened, when the modern world failed to provide explanations. Sheriff Bradshaw served out the remainder of his term, but didn't run for re-election in 1974. The events of those months had aged him, left him with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. He moved to Denver, where he worked as a private security consultant, and he rarely spoke about Pine Hollow or what had happened there. Agent Morrison returned to the FBI and continued her career, eventually rising to senior positions within the Bureau. But she never took another case involving unexplained deaths or ritualistic elements, always finding reasons to pass those assignments to other agents. The cave itself was sealed by order of the state government, the entrance dynamited and buried under tons of rock. The official explanation was that it was structurally unstable and posed a danger to hikers. The real reason, known only to a handful of people, was to ensure that whatever residual darkness remained in that place could never harm anyone again. The symbols on the walls, the altar, the evidence of centuries of predation, all of it was entombed beneath the mountain, hidden from a world that preferred rational explanations to uncomfortable truths. In the years that followed, Pine Hollow became known for what had happened in 1972 and early 1973, the town where a serial killer had terrorized the community before being stopped by law enforcement. The true nature of the Stikini, the shape-shifting creature from Seminole legend that had hunted there, was relegated to whispers and speculation, discussed only by those who had been there and those who believed in things beyond the material world. The owl feathers, those 7 white feathers arranged in perfect circles, became a symbol of those dark months, a reminder that sometimes the old stories contain truths that modern understanding struggles to accept. By the summer of 1973, Pine Hollow had regained much of its former character. The population had stabilized at around 300 residents, and while some families never returned, new people moved in, attracted by affordable property and the mountain lifestyle. The events of 1972 became the subject of countless conversations, theories, and eventually a sort of dark tourism that brought curious visitors to the town. A journalist from Denver wrote a feature article about the case, focusing on the FBI's investigation and the dramatic confrontation that had ended the killings. The article mentioned nothing about supernatural elements, presenting instead a straightforward narrative of law enforcement tracking down a deranged killer. But for those who lived through it, who had felt the fear that gripped the town during those months, the sanitized version felt incomplete, a story with crucial chapters missing. The 3 victims, Robert Mendoza, Janet Reeves, and Marcus Lee, were remembered in a memorial service held in May 1973. A small monument was erected in the town square, bearing their names and the dates of their deaths. The families of the victims found what solace they could in the knowledge that justice, of a sort, had been served. But closure remained elusive for many, the trauma of those months leaving scars that time could ease but never fully heal. Daniel Crowfoot's life changed in unexpected ways. His mother's Seminole heritage, which he had largely kept private in a town where Native American residents were few, became a source of interest and respect. people asked him about the old legends, about other creatures and spirits that might exist beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding. Daniel was careful in how he responded, sharing some stories while keeping others to himself, understanding that certain knowledge carried responsibilities he wasn't sure everyone was prepared to handle. He maintained contact with his aunt in Oklahoma, who had provided the information that ultimately saved Pine Hollow. She told him that the Stikini he had helped destroy was likely not the only one of its kind, that such creatures existed in various forms across different cultures and regions. But she also reassured him that they were rare, that most people would never encounter such darkness in their lifetimes. Daniel found some comfort in that, though he remained vigilant, always watching for signs of the unnatural, always ready to act if necessary. His auto repair shop became an unofficial gathering place for those interested in the unusual, and Daniel became a bridge between the town's present and the older, deeper knowledge that most modern communities had forgotten. The winter of 1973 to 1974 passed without incident, and Pine Hollow continued its slow journey back to normalcy. The FBI closed its temporary command center and withdrew its agents, leaving behind only a file box of reports and evidence that would gather dust in a federal archive. Agent Morrison sent a letter to Sheriff Bradshaw thanking him for his assistance and noting that the case had been successfully resolved. She made no mention of what they had witnessed in the cave, maintaining the official narrative in her correspondence. Tom understood why. Some truths were too dangerous, too disruptive to the established order, and institutions, like the FBI, depended on maintaining public confidence in rational, scientific approaches to crime solving. Acknowledging the existence of shape-shifting creatures from Native American folklore would undermine that confidence, opening doors to questions and fears that modern society preferred to keep closed. So the truth remained hidden, protected by classification and deliberate vagueness, known only to those who had been there. The town's residents gradually stopped looking over their shoulders when they walked at night, stopped checking their windows obsessively, stopped sleeping with weapons nearby. The fear that had defined Pine Hollow during those dark months slowly dissipated, replaced by a cautious optimism that perhaps the worst was truly over. But for Daniel, Sheriff Bradshaw, and the others who had been in that cave, the memory never faded. They had seen something that changed their understanding of reality, that proved the world contained mysteries and dangers that science couldn't explain. They carried that knowledge quietly, knowing that speaking of it too openly would invite skepticism at best, accusations of mental instability at worst. Daniel sometimes wondered if there were others like them, people scattered across the country who had encountered the supernatural and then returned to normal life, carrying secrets they could never fully share. He suspected there were, that beneath the surface of everyday existence, a hidden community of witnesses existed, bound together by experiences that defied conventional explanation. It was a lonely burden in many ways, but it also connected him to something older and deeper than the modern world, to traditions and truths that had existed long before towns like Pine Hollow were carved out of the wilderness. And so Pine Hollow moved forward, its past both remembered and obscured, its people forever changed by events they could discuss but never fully explain. By 1974, Pine Hollow had settled into a new equilibrium, a town that had faced darkness and survived, forever marked by the experience, but determined to continue. The memorial in the town square became a place where residents would pause during their daily routines, offering silent acknowledgement to those who had been lost. Children who were too young to remember 1972 would ask their parents about the names on the monument, and the parents would tell them simplified versions of the story, tales of a dangerous person who had hurt people before being stopped by brave law enforcement officers. The full truth, the story of the Stikini and the confrontation in the cave, remained known only to a select few. Daniel Crowfoot continued his work, both as a mechanic and as an informal keeper of knowledge about things beyond the ordinary. He married in 1975, a woman named Sarah who had moved to Pine Hollow from Colorado Springs, someone who accepted his connection to the town's dark past without demanding explanations he couldn't fully provide. Together, they raised 2 children, and Daniel made sure to teach them the old stories his mother had shared with him, wanting them to understand that the world held more than what could be seen or measured. Sheriff Bradshaw, though he had left Pine Hollow, maintained occasional contact with Daniel. The two men bound by the shared experience of that December night in 1973. In their rare phone conversations, they would discuss the case obliquely, never quite naming what they had witnessed, but acknowledging its ongoing impact on their lives. Tom told Daniel that he sometimes dreamed about the owl, about his transformation, and that he had developed a deep unease around birds of prey that he couldn't shake. Daniel understood, admitting that he too carried the psychological weight of what they had done, the knowledge that they had killed something that was both human and not human, that existed in a space between categories that modern thought struggled to accommodate. They agreed that they had done what was necessary, that Pine Hollow would have continued to suffer if they hadn't acted. But necessity didn't erase the moral complexity of destroying a being whose existence challenged every assumption they had held about the nature of reality. Agent Morrison never contacted them again after her initial letter, and Daniel suspected she had compartmentalized the experience, filed it away in whatever mental space allowed her to continue her career without being paralyzed by what she had witnessed. The years passed, and Pine Hollow's population grew slowly but steadily, reaching nearly 500 by the early 1980s. New businesses opened, the logging industry modernized, and tourism based on the area's natural beauty became an increasingly important part of the local economy. The events of 1972 faded into local legend, discussed less frequently as new residents arrived who had no direct connection to that time. But every few years, someone would write an article or produce a documentary about the case, bringing renewed attention to Pine Hollow and reminding the old-timers of the fear they had lived through. Daniel would decline interviews, preferring to let the official story stand unchallenged, knowing that the truth would never be believed anyway. He kept in touch with his aunt in Oklahoma until her death in 1989, and at her funeral, he met others from the Seminole community who knew the old stories, who understood what he had faced and what he had done. They thanked him, acknowledging the courage it took to confront a Stikini and the burden of carrying such knowledge in a world that denied its existence. For Daniel, that acknowledgement meant more than any official recognition ever could. Whatever happened in Pine Hollow, Colorado between 1972 and 1974 was never fully explained, at least not in ways that satisfied those who demanded rational, scientific answers. The official record spoke of a mentally disturbed woman who killed 3 people before being stopped by law enforcement in a remote cave. But those who knew the whole truth, who had been there in that moment of transformation and destruction, carried a different story. They knew that the world contained mysteries that predated modern civilization, that the old legends existed because they described real phenomena, real dangers that simply wore different names in different cultures. The Stikini that had hunted in the mountains above Pine Hollow was gone, its century-long predation ended by people who had the courage to believe in the impossible and act on that belief. The town survived, its people rebuilt their lives, and the story became history, told and retold until the edges blurred and the truth became indistinguishable from myth. But for Daniel Crowfoot, Tom Bradshaw, and the others who had been in that cave, the truth remained sharp and clear, a memory that would never fade, a reminder that sometimes the darkness is real, and sometimes ordinary people must find the strength to face it. Before you wander back into the shadows, make sure you hit that like button to keep these legends alive. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss another chilling tale from the dark corners of North American folklore. And whatever you do, activate the notification bell, because the next story might just be the one that keeps you up tonight. Stay curious. Stay brave.